So in the last topic, we introduced this theory of the behavior of law, which is meant to explain law as a quantitative variable that varies from case to case. And that conception of law is something that's very abstract. Every society will have different types of legal system, different types of legal decision-making, different rules, different procedures. But that idea of quantity of law, that's something you can observe in every society. That level of abstractness is what allows the theory to be a highly general theory applicable to all human societies. And we can say something similar about the concept of social status. Social status is a very fundamental aspect of the social world and a fundamental aspect of the social structure of a legal case. You can think of social status as being something like the quantity of resources a person has, whether the resource is wealth or respect or some sort of clout in society. Or you could also think of it the way we often talk about it in everyday life as a position and a kind of vertical distribution of people, the great human pile, I've heard it called. We speak of upper class versus lower class. We speak of the high and mighty versus the down and out. We speak of those who get looked up to and those who get looked down upon. This theory of law, we speak of social status in vertical terms as being higher or lower, higher status or lower status, higher elevation or lower elevation. It too is a very fundamental concept, a very abstract concept. It is a basic part of the social universe, like mass is a basic part of the physical universe. And you can find status differences in every society. But we can find different forms of status or different sources of status. And Black's theory recognizes several different kinds of status. He recognizes status that comes from wealth, which might be the most obvious to most people, but also status that comes from culture, status that comes from one's integration into society, status that comes from the degree of organization of a social group, and status that comes from respectability. And we can talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Wealth, again, might be the most obvious. That's material goods, or as Black calls it, the material means of existence. That includes food, water, shelter, and whatever resources like money you can use to buy those things or trade for those things. And a case between two wealthy people is a high-status case, and a case between two poor people is a low-status case. Culture can matter in two ways. One is through the amount of culture you absorb, your knowledge and skills and what you've learned. And in modern society, we think of this as education, how educated a person is. And we can look at educational level or educational credentials as a form of social status, with the most educated having a higher status than the least educated. Another way culture can provide a kind of social status is conventionality, or how frequent an aspect of culture is. It can act like a kind of status. This is the status that gives majorities, cultural majorities, a kind of advantage over cultural minorities. It's the kind of advantage that comes from being normal, whatever the standards for normal are in your time and place, versus being weird. So the most conventional, those with the most common ethnicity or religion or language, have a higher social status than the least conventional, those whose cultural characteristics, their language or ethnicity or religion, are least common. Integration's a kind of social status that comes from one's social participation, how much one is in the center of social life. Certain people are at the center of things. They participate in lots of stuff. They're plugged into all the networks and institutions. This is the kind of status that comes from being the popular kid in school versus the loner, or from being the person who, works the job, has a spouse and raises kids, and participates in social clubs and religious congregations, versus the person who doesn't have connections, doesn't have participations, isn't really valued for their contributions to different social institutions. So the most integrated, the people who are at the center of things, they have a higher status in this regard than the least integrated, people who are socially marginal, people who are at the sides with few contacts and involvements. Just like this theory is meant to apply to all societies and all stages of the legal process, it's also meant to apply to legal action by individuals as well as by groups. And when you compare individuals to groups, you often see the groups have a kind of advantage. And this advantage is organization, which Black defines as the capacity for collective action. Being able to act collectively is a kind of resource, and one that gives groups advantages over individuals. It gives bigger groups an advantage over smaller groups, And it gives groups that are more internally organized, that have, say, a division of labor and leadership, an advantage over ones that are more disorganized. And the organizations have a higher status, and the lone individuals have a lower status. And more organized organizations, more organized groups have a higher status, and less organized groups have a lower status. And finally, there's what you might call respectability, which is a form of status based on reputation, specifically one's moral reputation, one's reputation for being deviant or being virtuous. This kind of status increases when you get praised and rewarded for doing good things, and it decreases when you get condemned and gossiped about, or convicted of crimes, or otherwise have your record tarnished. So those who have a clean record of behavior, no criminal convictions, and they're admired and respected as upstanding citizens, they have a higher degree of respectability and thus a higher social status. Those who are widely seen as deviant, who have been punished before and have a long legal record, who are labeled as criminals or despised by society, they have a lower respectability and thus a lower social status. So how does social status affect law? Well, one relationship is that law varies directly with social status. What this means is that cases between high status people tend to attract more law than cases between low status people. And we're speaking here of cases where the parties are roughly equal in status, where they're from the same basic social class or social plane and have similar overall levels of wealth and respectability and integration and so forth. If you just look at cases where the parties have similar status, cases between people of equally low status result in less law than cases between those of equally high status. So a low status person who has a complaint against another low status person is less likely to file a lawsuit or call the cops than if it's a high status person who has the complaint against another high status person. For their part, the cops are less likely to take the case seriously if it's two low status people rather than two high status people. And if the cops refer the case to the prosecutor tends to take it more seriously when the victim or plaintiff is a person of high status, even if they're complaining about another person of high status. Conflicts between people of low status tend to get dismissed more often. Conflicts between high status people are more likely to go to court and more likely to result in a harsh punishment or a large damage settlement. So at every phase of the legal process, higher social status makes it more likely that there'll be a greater degree of law, a greater degree of legal involvement against the accused. And this relationship, has several mechanisms. One thing you might think is when you hear that wealthier and more educated Americans are more likely to contact a lawyer or hire a lawyer than poorer Americans are, well, obviously lawyers cost quite a bit of money, and that helps explain that relationship. But the point is the relationship holds regardless of the mechanism, and it often operates through different individuals taking different roles in the legal case. For example, there's a lot of evidence based on studies of police and on lower criminal courts that the legal system, legal officials, police, court clerks, prosecutors, are hesitant to get involved in the affairs of low-status people and inclined to dismiss their complaints as being trivial and refuse to define them as crimes in the first place. For example, consider the following case from New York City. Here's the case of a man who grew up in a poor minority neighborhood, recalling how when he was 7 years old, his 9-year-old brother was robbed on the street. Quote, "We called the police. We couldn't afford to lose $10. They took their time coming, and I'm pretty sure we're quite amused at this naive family, so serious about catching a thief in the South Bronx. This contact with the police shook my confidence in the world. Something was terribly wrong here. It was nothing they did. It was what they didn't do. They didn't take us seriously. They came because they had to come. They asked questions not because they thought the answers might help to catch the thief, but because they had to do something when we were so insistent. I looked at the two white officers and realized that while their mouths were saying one thing, their manner and attitudes were saying something else. We can't believe you made us walk up these stairs for a lousy robbery of $10. What's the matter with you people? Don't you know where you live?" The lesson was straightforward and clear. The police didn't care. This lesson would be reinforced again and again as I grew older. It would be more than 20 years before I would call them again. Like many others trapped in the ghettos of this country, I had learned that the police are not the answer when trouble comes to your door. And you can see other cases like this reported in the observational literature, including cases where, it looks like violence is imminent. Like people are going to start swinging at each other on the street, but it's in a ghetto neighborhood and, the officers aren't really concerned with it and they just drive on. And you also see this sort of thing happening at the level of, the prosecutor's office when it comes time to decide how harsh the charges are. Cases involving poorer or minority or less educated victims tend to result in lesser charges than cases against majority victims or wealthy victims. One study of cases in California found that penalties were harder when the alleged victim was a family person, a husband and father, than if they were a bachelor, showing the role of social integration in all this. But it's not just a matter of legal officials being less likely to take cases seriously when they involve lower status people. It can also be the reverse. It could be lower status people resisting legal intervention even when legal officials are trying to offer it. And this is a pattern you see as well. And sometimes the two patterns interact in complicated ways to produce a cycle of increasing hostility between poor and minority and otherwise low-status people and the law. Now consider, for one example, the country of Finland. Finland's most prominent low-status group are the Gypsies. And when a homicide occurs, Gypsies eschew all reliance on police and prosecutors, seeking instead to exact vengeance by killing the killer or one of the killer's close relatives. Quote, "Should authorities get involved in a blood feud, Gypsies will not cooperate and will even actively mislead them. An anthropologist who studied the Gypsies comments that the Gypsies will do everything in their power to keep law out of the case, including engaging in refusal to testify, deliberately misleading the authorities, and general non-cooperation with the Finnish judicial agents." And you see this kind of pattern in lots of societies among people at the bottom of society. There's a sort of hostility to law and a feeling that we can handle this ourselves and you should stay out of our business. So it comes from both sides, from the law not necessarily wanting to get involved and from people not necessarily wanting the law involved. But it all adds up to the same pattern, that cases between higher status people go further in the legal system than cases between lower status people, or in other words, law varies directly with social status.